Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Today I want to share with you the premises, principles and practices of a way of communication that we call transformative dialogue. It's an approach that values autonomy and connectedness, relatedness, to support conflict interactions, to improve them, and I believe it can be used in relationships, in organizations, and in communities. So my hope is by the end of this, I'll have persuaded you that there are certainly times when we should forget getting to yes, and that perhaps this idea of transformative dialogue might be something that's of interest for you in your work. So our first premise, and we actually saw this diagram earlier today, is that we must recognize that in different situations, there are different modes of leadership, of management, and of communication that are useful. If we're in this zone down here, where people are close to agreement and close to certainty about what needs to be done, then perhaps it's quite sensible to be in a directive mode and directing standard operating procedures and looking for efficiencies. But as we creep up this axis and consensus starts dropping away, we need to think a bit more politically and look for compromises. And as we head along this axis and things get further from certainty, perhaps we need to start experimenting more and testing and being a bit more adaptive. But I'm really interested in this big zone here and really what happens in that zone of complexity as we are sort of surfing on the edge of chaos. And I think all of us, whether we're working in communities or in organizations, are experiencing that more and more. A very turbulent environment, fast changing, a lot more complexity in our lives. In that zone of complexity, I think we need a mode of communication that allows us to embrace multiple perspectives and to gain insight from each, rather than simply trying to debate which perspective is the right one. And so I think we need to reflect on the fact that most of us have been brought up and trained and rewarded in our careers for being good at debating, for being good at presenting arguments, and for making sure that we are persuading people that our perspective is the right one. And maybe that's something we need to unlearn, or at least work out when to drop. We haven't been so well trained in learning how to listen to and respect and embrace multiple perspectives. And I think that's a problem. If we face conflict situations, and up here you've got two competing goals, so goal A on that axis and goal B on that axis. If you've got competing goals and you use a debate mode, then you end up with an either or a kind of win-lose situation. So one party wins, one party loses, so one party is satisfied, the other party remains deeply unsatisfied. If you go for some sort of compromise, some sort of agreement or settlement, if you go for getting to yes, then you end up with some sort of negotiation, and position 4 in the middle there is a kind of half-half. So it's a compromise. To get there, you've used some sort of negotiation, but there's still work remaining. And that's really significant. I think a number of peace agreements or negotiated settlements are simply a half-half result, and really in that half-half solution are the seeds for the next cycle of conflict and violence. So what we really want to do is get away from that frame of debate or compromise, of seeking to get to yes, and really transcend it and head towards position number 5, considering both and options, a different way of communicating, a dialogue process that allows both objectives, both goals to be achieved, and doesn't leave any work remaining. I should have said, sorry, there's one other position here that may not be obvious, but it's possible to do nothing. And that's simply kicking the problem down the road, agreeing to postpone or delay it. And that's often a course of action we see in reality, where perhaps we think by delaying we improve our chances of a better outcome for ourselves later down the track. But of course, that simply leaves all the work to be done later. So I think debate and negotiation do not create the new knowledge that is needed to transcend that paradigm. They simply put different perspectives, different arguments against each other. To generate new knowledge, new action, we must use a different form of communication, and we believe that's dialogue. And if we return to the ancient Greek meaning of dialogue, the root of dialogue, dialogos, it means through the words. It doesn't mean two words or two people, it's through the words. And the idea is that through this form of communication, you can generate new knowledge, new understanding, new options for action. So at Generations for Peace, we've been working with the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation to develop a specific form of dialogue that we're calling transformative dialogue. And the founding premise for this approach is that destructive conflict is really a crisis in human communications. I'd invite you to think about an acutely bad conflict that you've personally experienced. It might be in a personal relationship, could be in your organization, could be in a community setting. How did you feel in the midst of that conflict? Perhaps you felt weak and self-absorbed. Perhaps you felt powerless and paralyzed, uncertain, defensive, untrusting. And perhaps also you understand the weaker you felt, also the more self-absorbed you become, and then the weaker you feel, and so on. So in that sort of state, your conflict interactions with other people become quite negative. It's a descending spiral, becomes more destructive, more alienating, and even more demonizing of the other. Transformative dialogue focuses on valuing people's autonomy and relatedness. It doesn't seek to help to support people to reach agreement. It's not about getting to yes. It simply seeks to support people to become stronger and more responsive, to gain clarity, confidence, and connection in the midst of their conflict interactions, and to enable those conflict interactions to become more positive, more constructive, more connecting, more humanizing. So how do we do that? In focusing on autonomy, transformative dialogue supports empowerment shifts from weakness and self-absorption to greater strength and responsiveness, from feeling unsettled to feeling calmer, from feeling confused to feeling clearer, feeling fearful to feeling confident, feeling disorganized to feeling more organized, more decisive. And in supporting a shift from feeling self-absorbed to feeling more responsive, we're supporting a recognition shift. A shift from feeling defensive to being more open, feeling self-protective, more attentive to others, being narrow-minded to allowing yourself to open up to other perspectives, starting feeling more suspicious, becoming more trusting, and perhaps even starting in demonizing the others to humanizing the others. So it's really those empowerment shifts and recognition shifts that transformative dialogue is all about. And in doing that, the key principle for us is, in our practice, is to attend to people, to support them in the midst of their conflict interactions, but to maintain a non-directive intention. We talked a lot about intention yesterday. And that's really important, that we remain non-directive so as not to undermine people's autonomy. And that is our moral compass. So how does that non-directive intention play out in practice? Well, firstly, it means we don't charge into a situation with our own worldview and our own assumptions or prejudgments about what a conflict is about and what a solution might look like for it. Nor do we have as our intention that our role is to support people to reach an agreement. Again, it's not about getting to yes. Our role is only to support people to improve their conflict interactions. So we're not leading change, we're being attentive, we're supporting people, and we're really following the parties with patience, with humility, and with respect for and trust in their choices. So we begin by being present and attentive to people, by talking to people over 100 cups of coffee or tea, or in different environments, perhaps wine, slivovitz, whatever it may be in the local custom. And through those one-on-one conversations, we are constantly asking people who needs to talk to whom, about what, and how. And we need those answers to come from them, not to be prescribed by us. So this is not a linear process, as you can see with the arrows. It goes round and round, as one conversation may lead to suggestions about who else we should talk to, and issues emerge and then get a bit clearer and a bit more focused, and also suggestions become gradually more refined about how a discussion might usefully take place. So it's not a linear process, but there is perhaps a pattern to it. We may begin with lots of one-on-one conversations over those cups of coffee or tea, and that may lead to the opportunity for small intra-group conversations, and then eventually perhaps to be able to gather together a larger intergroup conversation. But even if we reach that stage, we continue the one-on-one conversations and the small group conversations between the larger group sessions. In each conversation, whether it's the large group, the small group, or even the one-on-one conversations, we must maintain that non-directive intention, supporting empowerment shifts and recognition shifts for more pro-social conflict interactions. And to do that, we use 4 particular non-directive responses that are really skills that need to be practiced until they're fluent. So I'll just run through them in turn. Reflecting back is the immediate, in the moment, precise, undistorted reflection back directly to a speaker of the exact words they've used, without any questioning or value judgment or filtering. And it supports that person to feel heard and to gain clarity. And it also supports the others who are listening to gain more clarity as to what was said. And we choose to reflect back when we feel a person is expressing weakness and self-absorption, or when we feel they've just expressed a significant shift. Summarizing is perhaps obvious. It's us offering the parties a quick summary of the topics that they have covered, and in particular, the elements of agreement and the elements of difference. This again supports the parties to gain clarity, and then they themselves are left to decide in what direction do they want to take the conversation next. Checking in is used to really surface attention to a particular behavior. Perhaps one person in the room is not participating at all in the discussion, or another person is being extremely disruptive in the conversation, or drawing attention to perhaps an external constraint. It could be that the time for which a meeting room or catering is available is becoming a factor. But in calling out that behavior or that constraint, again, the decision about what to do next is always given to the parties. Staying out, the 4th skill, is perhaps one of the hardest. We have to resist that directive impulse, that impulse to jump in, to suggest a solution, to take control of the conversation, or to reduce the tension in the room. And indeed, in transformative dialogue, we don't seek to avoid or close down heightened emotions. Instead, we follow the heat and allow the temperature to rise, maintaining a calm, attentive presence as a facilitator. And then when appropriate, we may choose to reflect back, because those emotional outbursts are really expressions of weakness and self-absorption. So what does it all look like? Well, it can be small or larger, informal or more formal. And at Generations for Peace, we're testing transformative dialogue in very different conflict contexts in communities. I think it may offer those of us working in communities or in organizations, a way of addressing conflict interactions and supporting people in those empowerment and recognition shifts. I think many of you may share my concern about human communication in this age when societies and communities, even organizations, are becoming increasingly fragmented. So in closing, I don't think facilitating transformative dialogue is easy. I certainly don't think it's a magic bullet, but I do think it offers us an important possibility for improving conflict interactions in relationships, in organizations, and in communities. And it may offer a valuable additional option in coaching or consulting practice. I also think in this room there's a lot of very relevant experience that I could also learn from, and I hope that we can start a conversation in the Change Leaders about transformative dialogue. That's my hope for today. I'll be happy to discuss with you afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you.